Iran cannot defeat the United States in a direct military war. Almost everyone understands that, which makes the current situation feel a little strange, because right now, Iran seems to be pushing the region closer to conflict. If a country knows it cannot win a war, why provoke one? Over the past few weeks, tensions in the Middle East have been rising again. Airstrikes, drones, missiles, ships being attacked, energy facilities hit. At first glance, it looks like the beginning of another Middle East war. And yet, the more I watch what is happening, the more that question keeps coming back. If Iran knows it cannot defeat the United States in a direct military confrontation, why keep pushing the situation closer to war? Maybe Iran simply isn't afraid of war. Maybe they believe determination, ideology, or sheer resilience can balance the gap in military power. History has seen countries think that way before. But then again, Iran has spent decades watching American wars unfold right next to its borders. The Gulf War in 1991, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the long war in Afghanistan. Iran saw how those wars played out, armies collapsing in weeks, air defenses erased in days, precision strikes launched from ships hundreds of miles away. And the scale of those wars was enormous. Researchers at Brown University estimate that the United States has spent more than $8 trillion on wars in the Middle East since 2001. $8 trillion. Iran has been watching all of this for decades, which makes the current situation feel even more puzzling. Because despite all of that, Iran keeps raising the pressure, threatening shipping routes, striking ships, targeting energy infrastructure, and all of that keeps drawing the world's attention to one narrow strip of water, the Strait of Hormuz. At its narrowest point, it is only about 30 miles wide, but nearly 1/5 of the world's oil passes through it every single day. If something disrupts that route, even briefly, energy markets across the planet can shake. Years ago, Iran's President Hassan Rouhani said something that now feels surprisingly relevant. If Iran cannot export its oil, no other country in the region will export its oil. It was a warning. And today, that warning suddenly feels a lot less theoretical. But something about this conflict still feels unusual. Iran is raising the pressure. The United States and Israel are responding. And yet neither side seems to be escalating all the way. Which raises a strange question. If both sides clearly have the ability to escalate much further, why does this conflict still seem so carefully controlled? That question from the beginning of this video keeps coming back. If Iran knows it cannot defeat the United States in a direct military war, why keep pushing the region closer to conflict? If Iran truly wanted to avoid war, it could behave very differently. It could slow things down, reduce attacks, lower the tension, or move quickly toward negotiations. But that's not really what we are seeing. Iran keeps responding. Iran keeps issuing threats. Iran keeps the pressure high, almost as if this confrontation is not something they are trying to avoid. So what could Iran actually be trying to do? One obvious possibility is oil. Iran sits right next to one of the most sensitive oil routes in the world, the Strait of Hormuz. At its narrowest point, it is only about 30 miles wide, and yet roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply passes through this narrow waterway every single day. That's around 20 million barrels of oil moving through this channel daily. Some energy analysts call it the most important oil route on Earth, which means even a small disruption here can shake global markets. And Iran knows that. A few drones, a damaged tanker, a few days of uncertainty, and suddenly oil prices can move very quickly. So maybe the strategy is simple. Raise the tension, push oil prices higher, gain leverage from the global energy market. But then another thought appears. Would that really be worth it? War is incredibly risky. It invites retaliation. It threatens shipping. It risks instability inside Iran itself. If the goal were only to push oil prices higher, this would be a very dangerous way to do it, which makes the situation feel even stranger, because if Iran is not really trying to win a war, and maybe not just trying to raise oil prices either, then what exactly are they trying to trigger? And to understand that, we need to look at what usually happens when oil prices start rising. So let's stay with that idea for a moment. What if oil really is part of the story? Iran sits right next to the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most sensitive oil routes in the world. Every day, enormous volumes of oil pass through this narrow channel. Tankers leaving Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Iraq, all of them funnel through the same stretch of water before reaching global markets, which means the entire energy system becomes extremely sensitive to what happens in this one place. But Iran doesn't actually need to close the Strait of Hormuz to move the market. Sometimes simply raising the risk is enough. A tanker damaged, a drone strike near shipping lanes, a few days of tension at sea, and suddenly insurance costs rise. Shipping slows down, some tankers start taking longer routes. Within hours, energy markets around the world begin reacting, because oil markets do not only respond to real disruptions, they also react to the fear of disruption. So at first glance, the strategy seems obvious. Raise the tension, shake the oil market, push prices higher. That would make sense. Except, something about that explanation still feels incomplete. Because if the goal were only to push oil prices higher, this would be an incredibly dangerous way to do it. War invites retaliation, shipping routes can collapse, instability can spiral out of control. That is a very large gamble, just to move oil prices, which makes the situation even more puzzling, because if Iran is not really trying to win a war, and maybe not just trying to raise oil prices either, then something else must happen after oil starts rising. And that is where the story starts to become much more interesting. So let's imagine something for a moment. Not oil prices jumping for a few days, but oil staying high for a long time, because when energy stays expensive, things start moving across the entire economy. Airlines suddenly pay far more for fuel. Shipping companies see transport costs climb. Factories spend more just to keep machines running. Even supermarkets begin to feel it, because when energy becomes expensive, almost everything else slowly follows. Food, transportation, basic goods. And when this pressure lasts long enough, people begin to spend less. Businesses become cautious. Growth starts slowing down. We have seen this pattern before. In the 1970s, a sudden oil shock sent prices soaring around the world. Gas stations in the United States had lines stretching down the street. Entire economies struggled under the weight of rising energy costs. Energy shocks have a strange way of spreading. They rarely stay inside the oil market. Sooner or later, they begin touching everything else. And when that happens, countries that control key energy routes suddenly gain a different kind of influence, because now the entire global economy becomes sensitive to what happens in one narrow place, which quietly changes the position of a country like Iran. A country that once looked heavily isolated now sits next to one of the most sensitive pressure points in the global system. And if instability continues there long enough, the entire world eventually has to pay attention, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if the real impact of this conflict is not happening on the battlefield at all? What if it begins inside the global economy instead? So, if the real impact of this conflict begins inside the global economy, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What would Iran actually gain from that? Because on the battlefield, the balance of power is obvious. The United States and Israel have overwhelming military advantages. Iran knows that, but economic pressure works very differently, and Iran has already been living under that pressure for years. Sanctions have restricted its oil exports, its banking system has been pushed out of much of the global banking system, and tens of billions of dollars of Iranian assets remain frozen abroad. Iranian leaders have spent years demanding relief from those sanctions, because for them, sanctions are not just political pressure. They shape almost every part of the country's economy. But now imagine something different. Imagine that pressure spreading outward, not just inside Iran, but across the global economy. High energy prices begin squeezing major economies. Factories face rising costs. Governments worry about inflation. Energy importing countries begin looking for stability in the Gulf. And when enough countries begin feeling that pressure, the political conversation often starts to shift. The question slowly changes from how do we isolate Iran to something very different. How do we stabilize the region? And that shift matters because Iran sits next to one of the most sensitive oil routes on Earth. There is an old line in geopolitics often attributed to Henry Kissinger: control oil and you control nations. If instability near that route begins shaking the global economy, Iran is no longer just a sanctioned country. It becomes part of the solution everyone is suddenly looking for, which could reopen the door to things Iran has been asking for during negotiations for years. Easing sanctions, access to frozen assets, more freedom to sell oil, recognition of parts of its nuclear program. Iran's leaders often say something else as well. They say the sanctions were meant to break their country. But, in their words, they didn't. So maybe Iran does not need to win this war on the battlefield. Maybe the conflict only needs to last long enough for economic pressure to reshape the negotiations that follow. And if that is even partly true, then this war may not really be about victory. It may be about time. But that made me start thinking about something else. If Iran might actually benefit from tension lasting longer, what about the United States? Why would Washington allow a conflict like this to continue? The official explanation has always been nuclear weapons. For years, American leaders have said the goal is simple: stop Iran from building a nuclear bomb. And at first, that sounds perfectly reasonable. But the more I thought about it, the stranger it felt. Because Iran's nuclear program is not new. It has been discussed for more than 20 years. For 2 decades, there have been negotiations, sanctions, inspections, deals. In 2015, there was even a major international agreement built around exactly this issue, so that made me pause for a moment. If the nuclear problem has existed for so long, why would it suddenly require a military confrontation now? Another explanation people often mention is oil. The United States produces a huge amount of oil today, so if oil prices rise, American oil companies can make more money. But then another question came to my mind. Would a country really risk a massive war just to make oil more expensive? Because modern wars are unbelievably costly. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan alone cost the United States more than $2 trillion. $2 trillion. Thousands of soldiers lost their lives. And the consequences lasted for years. Starting a major conflict just to push oil prices higher would be an enormous gamble. So if it's probably not really about nuclear weapons, and it's probably not just about oil, then something else might be happening here. And that's when I started noticing a strange pattern. Whenever the world becomes unstable, people panic, investors panic, governments panic, companies panic. And when that happens, everyone starts looking for the safest place to protect their money. For decades, that place has usually been the United States. During the financial crisis in 2008, for example, huge amounts of money rushed into American government bonds, even though the crisis actually began in the United States. Former U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson once described it very simply. He said, "When the world gets scared, it buys U.S. treasuries." In other words, when things start looking dangerous around the world, a lot of money suddenly moves toward the United States. People buy American government bonds. They hold dollars. They move their savings into American markets. And that gives the United States a very unusual advantage. Borrowing money becomes easier. More money starts moving through the American economy. And American investors suddenly find opportunities to buy assets around the world at much lower prices. I explained this cycle in more detail in the previous video, but if something similar happens again, a global economic crisis could weaken many countries at the same time, while the center of the system remains relatively stable, which leads to a strange possibility. Maybe the real advantage in this conflict does not come from winning quickly. Maybe it comes from how long the tension lasts, because if oil prices rise slowly and economic pressure spreads across the world, the consequences could reach far beyond the Middle East and far beyond the battlefield. And that leads to a very strange possibility. If Iran cannot defeat the United States in a direct military war, but it can still stretch the conflict, trigger an energy shock, and increase its leverage in negotiations, then maybe Iran doesn't actually need a quick victory. And if the United States can also benefit from large disruptions in the global economy, then maybe Washington doesn't need this war to end quickly either. So maybe the real question here isn't who wins the war. Maybe the real question is how long the tension lasts. Because in conflicts like this, time matters, energy matters, and endurance matters. But this is where the story becomes even stranger. Because somewhere else in the world, there is another country sitting on an ocean of oil. In fact, it has even more oil than Iran. And yet the strategy of the United States there looks completely different, almost the opposite. Why would Washington treat two massive oil powers in completely different ways? What makes one region a place of constant tension, while the other is handled so carefully? That mystery reveals something much deeper about how global power really works. And that's exactly what we're going to explore in the next video.